will be turned in at the end of the lecture.
So if we have to turn in notes, how do you help us?
Well, by
Isn't the point of
hearing
notes
it,
to study and
writing
review?
it down, and then practicing it in the lab, it helps cement it in your brain.
Oh, this one again. Hey, buddy. How you doing?
There's the pencil I hit. I knew this would come in handy one day.
Where did you hide that?
Back, it almost
Need a
looks
piece of
like
paper
a
there,
wire where I
Hamilton?
hit it.
Yes.
Why I always carry an extra notebook. Okay, this last lesson is welding positions and your different kinds of welding joints. So most of you are getting pretty close to finishing up with your welding pads. And after wire feed next week and the following weeks, you guys will be hopefully starting on your small personal projects. So your different welding positions and your welding joints will be very important to know, because the same welding positions and welding joints that you use in stick welding are the same ones that you're going to use for wire feed, oxyacetylene, and TIG. Does that make sense? Yep. And then in your notes, as we're going along here, I want you guys to define or illustrate each of the welding positions that we cover. In your illustration of each welding position, I want you guys to draw down two three-dimensional plates that you'd be welding on, the electrode, and the direction of travel and how those plates will be oriented, whether that be up and down, or flat, or horizontal. It's crucial that your notes properly represent what the welding position is that you're trying to show me. And then after we move through our different welding positions, we're going to go into our welding joints, and then I'm going to have you guys again either define or illustrate each of those welding positions or welding joints. Sorry about that. Make sense? And then with your welding joints, rather than drawing the electrode and all that stuff and the direction of travel, I just want you guys to place where the bead would go on your welding joints. Okay. Starting off, we're going to go with the most common welding position, one that all you guys have practice with right now, and that is welding in the flat position. You guys should be somewhat familiar with the welding positions already based off of what we learned from our different welding rods.
So to draw a three-dimensional plate.
What if you cannot write three-dimensional?
Well, you can draw just basically two plates lying flat and label that's flat on the table. Make sure you mark that it's flat on the table and not held horizontally.
Yeah, my drawing isn't there, you're right.
So basically, when you're welding in the flat position, that means you just laid your workpiece on the table and you're going over the top at about a 90-degree angle or a little bit less, either trailing or leading.
So it's like. Yeah, those are my plates, by the way.
Okay.
There's one right there, and then there's one right there. And then my little beads go right there. It's flat.
Okay. Oop. Got a red pen, that works, or a blue pen actually might work better for you there. Okay. next position that's gonna be important for some of you, especially those of you when you get to your personal projects, like Kenny with his headache rack, you're likely gonna be going in a horizontal position, which means your workpiece is sitting 90 degrees to the table, and you're gonna be welding across with your electrode running across the bead like this. The horizontal position's a little bit harder to control because your bead's gonna try and run downwards. So it's crucial to use a welding rod at the right temperature, because if you have it too hot, you're gonna see your beads start to just kinda slough downward on you, and then you're gonna end up with not enough filler material on your top piece.
There's my table and there's my thingy that I'm on.
You wanna draw out where the electrode's gonna be running across, and then the direction of travel for it, Zane?
Ooh, that's gonna. I didn't think that through when I drew that like that.
You can always redraw if you need to.
Here, I'll just pretend that my table's extended and it has 3 legs.
Okay. So,
And then,
see most of you having trouble kind of trying to interpret this. We're gonna say that we have our welding plates right here. So here's our welding plates, here's our welding gap. Your electrode is gonna come in right about here, and it's gonna move across. The plate's going that direction. Does that make sense?
that's where my.
So for any of you who have like a headache rack, or you're building a box, or something that's on a stand, you're probably gonna be practicing this position. Another vital welding position for those of you working on 3-dimensional projects is going to be the vertical up and vertical down welding positions. And that's when you station your plates 90 degrees with the seam running up and down to your table.
So it's like a book.
Yep, imagine you're welding on the inside of a book. Or you're welding 2 plates that are sitting flat to each other, the 2 edges butted up against each other, running up and down. This is a little bit easier than the horizontal weld.
So vertical up or down, so vertical up, you'd be moving up, and vertical down.
Yep, vertical up, you'd be moving your welding rod up, so basically you're stacking the bead on top of itself. And then vertical down is a little bit trickier because you're trying to string the bead down. And depending on what you're welding and the kind of properties you're looking for in your weld will determine which process you use. For the most part, I expect you guys to do vertical up, because vertical down is not a very common welding position anymore.
Dude, I figured out how to draw a book. You draw a stick person without a head, and then you just connect the arms and legs.
Good job. Yep. Good. After that, our next welding position that you'd likely see, especially for Zane and Moritz, because you guys are also doing welding in the 7th grade class here coming up pretty soon on the trailer frame,
Oh, okay.
is overhead welding, which is where you're welding from the underside of the joint. So you're usually welding above your head, and your weld surface is up above you, and you're angling up into it and moving across horizontally.
How'd you draw? Would it be like,
Pretty much you draw it the same as a flat or a horizontal weld, except you draw the stick angling up towards it
that?
rather than angling down. Yep,
And you can move either direction.
yep. You can move either left or right depending on whether you're left or right-handed.
Go up or down.
Yep, if you're going up or down, that's technically considered a vertical weld. Any questions so far? Give you guys a little bit of time to finish labeling your drawings here. It's also going to be important to note that for those of you who finish up with your welding pads early, I'm going to have you guys start practicing some of these different welding positions and welding joints. So you guys get a little bit of experience doing them before you actually move on to, say, your personal projects.
So for our personal projects, do we have to use a stick welder, or can we use any welder, because by then you will have taught us wire feed too?
Yep, by then I will have taught you wire feed, but these welding positions and welding joints, like I stated at the beginning of class, apply to any form of welding.
But when we do our project, doesn't matter which welder we use.
It depends on
What you're making.
what you're making and what you prefer, and the type of metal you're using. For rusty, thick metal, you probably want to use a stick welder. If you've got nice, clean metal that's not too thick, you can probably get away using wire feed. Doug, is everybody caught up? Good. The next portion of this that we're going to cover is your different welding joints. And probably the first welding joint that you guys see everywhere is a lap joint.
Is that the flat one?
Yep, that's a flat position weld where one plate is stacked on top of another and the bead is run on the surface of one plate, connecting the top surface to the edge of the second plate.
What's that called?
That's called a lap joint.
It's like
I
that.
can draw it up on the board for you guys here.
I was confused because at first I thought he said a whack joint.
That's pretty whack though.
Did Josh ever say that?
What?
Yeah, never mind. You weren't there, you didn't see the movie.
Which one?
I just drew 2 lines, and then I filled it in and said weld.
So, your lap joint is going to look something like this, and your weld is going to build up right here. And that's what your lap joint should look like. Usually you use lap joints when you're trying to place one piece of metal over another to kind of get a thicker piece, or when you're trying to weld 2 plates together using a third. Make sense?
Yeah.
Another joint that I can draw from this drawing right now for you guys. Remember, this has to be a separate drawing in your notes. Is taking it down to here, where you lay your pieces of metal over each other, make sure your edges are parallel, and then you weld your edges together. That is called an edge weld. This is probably the most common method used when trying to get 2 plates of metal to build up a thick pad. Usually you see this a lot on trailer frames where they weld another plate over an I-beam. Zane, you should have experience with this after trying to cut apart someone who did an edge weld to double up on the frame of that trailer. It's a pain to go through, isn't it? Yep. This is called an edge weld.
4 times. Almost done.
I hope my pictures are good enough.
If you run out of room on the front, be sure to move to the back of your paper. Don't try to clutter everything on one page. And then for those of you that are going to be building like headache racks or stands or anything like that, you're probably going to have a little bit of experience with this joint. And this is called a T-joint. So, on a T-joint, your weld is made right where the 2 plates meet, where one plate is standing perpendicular or at 90 degrees to your base plate. And you can either weld one side or you can weld both sides. Everything making sense so far?
Yeah.
Good. Another joint that's pretty similar to this would be a corner joint. But with a corner joint, you don't exactly have to have everything at 90 degrees. The 2 plates can be at either angle, but you take 2, let me use a better marker here, conjoining edges of a plate, or 2 conjoining edges of 2 different plates.
Trying to get like a base there.
And you lay a weld. So here's your angle, and this can be anywhere from, say,
180.
30 degrees
30.
to about 150 degrees. And your weld will be placed right at the corner between those 2 joints.
Corner.
Thus we come up with the name corner joint. Make sense? The last joint we're going to cover, which would make us 5 out of 5, is just a butt joint where you take 2 plates flat or horizontal, and you basically weld them edge to edge. So the plates sit flat on a table, and you build up a weld either between the 2 plates or just on top of the plates. depending on the thickness of the material.
Isn't that the one you showed us in the beginning?
What I showed you in the beginning was a lap joint, and that's where the plates overlap.
Never mind.
Hence the name lab.
Good job, Zach. You got
Yep.
it.
Probably some important characteristics to note when you're welding and to look for is the size of your bead and the fusion between your plates. Especially on welds where you have a bit of a gap between your two plates. If your back and forth movement or your pattern is too quick, you're going to see a weld that looks relatively inconsistent with slag buildup right in between the two plates. That's if you move back and forth too fast between the two plates that you're trying to weld. So it's important to take your time and to move at a nice steady pace and be paying attention to your weld pool. Just like you have on your buildup pads, because your weld pool indicates how everything's going in your weld. And you can usually see if you're getting fusion between the plates or if you're just simply putting filler material over the top of a gap. Make sense?
Yeah.
Also when welding, there's two different kinds of welds that you're going to look at, and these will indicate your temperature of your weld. We have a flat weld, or a flat bead on top. So say you're doing a T-joint. We have a, hey, Mr. Broughton, is it convex or concave when it curves inward?
Concave.
Concave.
Okay.
I always get those two confused, thank you. So you have a concave weld, and you have a convex weld. Typically we'll want to see something that looks fairly flat on top. That indicates you have pretty good fusion, and you have adequate filler material being deposited into the weld. If we see a concave weld, that means you're either running too hot or you have too little filler material between your weld plates. And if a weld's too hot, you oftentimes run into areas where you're going to have brittleness on the edges of your weld, which is exactly where your weld's going to fail. Because the weld should be the strongest point of your conjoined materials. And when a weld fails, it usually fails on the edges of the weld, especially if you get it too hot. If we get a convex weld pool going, that means you're either too cold, which is not enough amperage, or you have too much filler material. And that usually means you'll see the weld bead kind of curl under a little bit, or it'll be very steep. And some people, if the weld's bad enough, they call it a bird turd, which is a pretty good visual for a bad weld. So, you guys have any questions? Zane? Any questions? Did everybody get everything down in their notes?
Yeah.
Were you guys able to label everything? Label your electrode? Kind of designate the path of your weld on your welding positions with an arrow?
Yeah.
Yep. If we're all done here, I'll collect your assignments, and you guys need to go out to the shop And finish working on your welding pads. Be sure you use safety glasses, make sure your auto darkening helmets are turned on or working before you start welding.
I feel like that's directed towards me.
That's directed towards everyone, because eye protection in the welding lab is of the utmost importance, because the slightest mistake and you could wind up at the eye doctor having them explain that you have floating rods in your eyes and blind spots.